The Telltale Heart, extended version. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, am I mad? Hearken. And observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. There was no object, no passion. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye, with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So, you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no. It was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it had welled up from my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him although I chuckled at heart. I slowly opened the lantern until a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the beam as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. With a loud yell, I leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily, to find the deed so far done. But, for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me, it would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all, ha! As the clock struck 4, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night, suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentlemen welcome. I led them to the chamber. I brought chairs into the room, and desired them here to rest from their fatigues. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. But, ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. It grew louder. Villains! I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. The Fall of the House of Usher, extended version. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but, with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. I had received a letter from Roderick Usher, my boyhood companion, entreating my immediate presence. He spoke of an acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder that oppressed him, and of his earnest desire to see me, his only personal friend, for solace in his affliction. Though we had not met for years, his request carried an urgency that I could not ignore. Thus, I approached the mansion, my mind filled with foreboding. As I entered the house, I was greeted by a servant who led me through dimly lit corridors, whose tapestries swayed eerily in the faint air that carried an almost imperceptible vibration. The atmosphere itself seemed burdened with a nameless dread. Finally, I was ushered into the presence of Roderick Usher. He was changed, terribly altered. A cadaverous pallor hung over his once handsome features, his hair unkempt, his eyes luminous with an unnatural fire. He grasped my hand with nervous fervor, and in a voice trembling with emotion, he expressed his deep relief at my arrival. He spoke of his malady, an affliction of the senses, wherein the faintest sound tormented him, the dimmest light seemed ablaze, and even the texture of his garments weighed upon him like iron. More distressing than his own condition, however, was that of his beloved sister, Madeline Usher. She suffered from a strange and mysterious illness, one that baffled physicians and seemed to drain the very essence of life from her. She moved like a shadow through the house, silent and spectral, appearing only briefly before vanishing again into the depths of her chambers. As the days passed, I endeavored to soothe my friend, engaging him in conversation, in music, in literature, but all to no avail. His mood remained restless and foreboding, his very being interwoven with the decaying structure of his ancestral home. He would often fix his gaze upon unseen specters, whispering of an intangible force that governed his fate, of a sentient energy dwelling within the walls of the house itself. One evening, Usher came to me, his face gaunt with terror. His sister, he claimed, had finally succumbed to her mysterious affliction. Together, we bore her body to the family tomb, a deep and ancient vault beneath the mansion. With great care, we placed her within the coffin, sealing her away behind an iron door. Yet, as we did so, I could not shake the sense of an unnameable horror. Her face still bore the faintest flush of life. 4 days after, Usher's condition worsened. He wandered the halls at night, muttering incoherently, his eyes sunken deep within their sockets. The storm that had long threatened finally broke, and a tempest raged outside. The house trembled with the force of the wind, and an unnatural light flickered upon the tarn. Then, on the 7th night after Madeline's entombment, something dreadful occurred. As I lay restless in my chamber, I heard a faint, dreadful sound, a low, muffled cry, as though from within the very walls. A terror seized me, and I rushed to Usher's chamber. He sat, motionless, his wide eyes staring at nothing. "Do you not hear it?" he whispered. "She is there. In the vault. Alive." A ghastly realization struck me. Had we buried her too soon? The sound grew louder, a frantic struggle within the iron walls below. Then, with a thunderous crash, the great doors of the vault burst open, and there stood Madeline Usher. Her white robes were stained with the struggle of her entombment, her face a ghastly mask of suffering and fury. With a cry that froze my very blood, she staggered forward and fell upon her brother. In that moment, the last breath of life left Roderick Usher's body, and he perished in the embrace of his spectral sister. A deafening crack split the air, the mansion itself trembled. The walls groaned as though alive, the floors heaved beneath my feet. I fled in terror, rushing out into the storm. As I reached the far bank of the tarn, a great and terrible sound filled the night. I turned just in time to witness the house of Usher split asunder, the walls collapsing, the stones crumbling, The entire edifice swallowed into the dark waters of the tarn, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. And thus, with that final, dreadful descent, the last of the House of Usher was no more. At Kanchaknapong R6F. The Black Cat, Extended Version. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet, mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror, to many they will seem less terrible than Baroque. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these, I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood, I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my fondness for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusions to the ancient popular notion, which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, that was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted, in this manner, for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when, by accident or through affection, they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated, from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when, in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed, at once, to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, jinn-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty, but it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left, as to be at first grieved by the evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation. And then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives, than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or a silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense, hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. The Mask of the Red Death, extended version. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body and especially upon the face of the victim were the ban of their existence, shutting them out from the aid and the sympathy of their fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of their seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which followed the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber, into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause, momentarily, in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion, and then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But now a new presence was among them. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. A throng of revelers had found themselves suddenly in the black chamber, and, as they turned their eyes toward the figure, it moved with solemn and measured steps among them. The figure took no heed of their whispers or their glances of terror. The ebony clock struck, and in the same instant the figure stood still and turned to face the prince. Prince Prospero, in his rage, seized a dagger and rushed toward the spectral guest. But in the moment of his attack, he let out a terrible cry and fell lifeless to the ground. The masked intruder had proved to be the Red Death itself. One by one, the revelers succumbed to the plague, and as the last one fell, the lights of the tripods expired. Darkness and decay and the Red Death held dominion over all. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. The Monkey's Paw, extended version. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled outside the small house on Labanam Villa, rattling the windows and sending bursts of rain against the glass. Inside, by the glow of a crackling fire, Mr. White and his son Herbert sat at a chessboard, while Mrs. White knitted quietly in her chair. The mood in the home was warm and pleasant, untouched by the darkness outside. "Check," Herbert announced with a triumphant grin. His father, frowning, studied the board carefully. "I should hardly think that we'd have time to play another game," he mused aloud. "I expect that visitor will be here any moment now." Indeed, the expected visitor arrived soon after, a man of burly build with a weathered face, dressed in a military uniform darkened by the elements. He removed his coat, shaking off the droplets of rain before stepping fully into the room. His name was Sergeant Major Morris, an old friend of Mr. White's who had been away in foreign lands, serving in India for many years. After some drinks and talk of distant adventures, the conversation took a darker turn. Sergeant Major Morris spoke of strange places, odd customs, and, eventually, the monkey's paw, a small, shriveled thing, mummified and twisted, with a dreadful reputation. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, he explained. A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. "And you have had your 3 wishes?" inquired Mr. White, leaning forward with curiosity. "I have," the soldier said solemnly. "And they came true, each one of them. But not in the way I had hoped." The family pressed him for more details, but the man would not say more. Instead, he took the paw and flung it into the fire. With a cry, Mr. White retrieved it, brushing the ashes away. "Why would you throw it away if it grants wishes?" The sergeant major shook his head. "If you must wish, wish wisely. And be prepared for the consequences." Despite Morris's warning, curiosity got the better of Mr. White. He made the first wish for something modest yet practical, £200, enough to clear the family's small debts. Nothing happened. No sound, no flash of light, no strange sensation. Disappointed yet amused, the family dismissed it as mere superstition. However, the next day, a well-dressed man from Herbert's place of work arrived at their home. His face was grave, his words hesitant. He had come with terrible news. Herbert had been killed in an accident at the factory. And the company, though not legally bound, wished to offer compensation for their loss, exactly £200. Grief-stricken, the Whites buried their son and fell into despair. Mrs. White, wild with grief, soon remembered the monkey's paw. "Make another wish," she begged her husband. "Wish him back." Mr. White hesitated, horrified by the thought. Herbert had been mangled in the machinery. What kind of state would he return in? But under his wife's insistence, trembling, he lifted the paw and wished their son alive again. Hours passed. Then, as the night deepened, there came a soft, distant knocking at the door. Mrs. White gasped. "It's him. He's come back." She rushed toward the door, but Mr. White, paralyzed with dread, could not move. The knocking came again, louder, insistent. With a strangled cry, Mr. White fumbled for the monkey's paw. Desperate, frantic, he made his final wish just as his wife undid the last bolt of the door. She flung it open. There was nothing there. A cold wind rushed into the house, and the night beyond was empty. The monkey's paw lay lifeless in Mr. White's trembling fingers. Whatever he had wished for last, the horror had been undone. The story of the monkey's paw would be told and retold for generations, a grim reminder of fate's cruel and mysterious nature. At Kanchaknapong, R6F. The Most Dangerous Game, Extended Version. The darkness of the Caribbean night pressed in around the yacht as it cut through the moonlit waters. Sanger Rainsford leaned against the rail, enjoying the crisp night air, while his friend Whitney spoke about their upcoming hunting trip in South America. The discussion turned toward the nature of hunting itself, and Whitney mused about how the hunted might feel. "You're a big game hunter, not a philosopher," Rainsford laughed. "Who cares how the jaguar feels?" "Perhaps the jaguar does," Whitney replied. "Even animals can feel fear." Rainsford dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand, but as fate would have it, he would soon learn just how it felt to be prey. A sudden sound, a gunshot, shattered the night's silence. Startled, Rainsford leaned over the railing, trying to catch sight of whatever lay beyond the mist-covered waters. Just as he did, the yacht gave a sudden lurch, and Rainsford lost his balance. He plunged into the sea, gasping as the cold water swallowed him whole. The yacht steamed away, its engines oblivious to his desperate cries. Alone in the vast ocean, Rainsford fought against the waves, swimming toward the distant shore where he had seen a flicker of light. Hours passed before he reached the rugged coastline. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the wet sand, slipping into unconsciousness. When he awoke, the sun was high in the sky, and he took stock of his surroundings. The island was dense with jungle, the trees pressing in on all sides. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and he set off in search of food and shelter. Before long, he stumbled upon signs of civilization, a massive, chateau-like mansion that loomed atop a cliff. With cautious hope, he approached the imposing structure and knocked. The door was answered by a towering man with a dark, expressionless face. The man, Ivan, was deaf and mute, but another figure soon emerged, tall, refined, and dressed in elegant hunting attire. He introduced himself as General Zaroff, the master of the island. Over a luxurious dinner, Zaroff revealed his passion for hunting. But as the conversation progressed, Rainsford felt a growing unease. Zaroff spoke of ordinary hunting with disdain, claiming it no longer challenged him. He required more intelligent prey, something that could reason. Rainsford's blood ran cold as the general finally admitted his secret. "I hunt men. Horrified, Rainsford refused to believe it at first, but the truth was undeniable. Zaroff had turned his island into a twisted game reserve, where shipwrecked sailors were given a chance to survive for 3 days while he hunted them down. If they lived, they would be set free. If they lost, they died. "I'm a hunter, not a murderer," Rainsford protested. "Is there any difference?" Zaroff mused. "You enjoy the hunt, do you not?" Imagine, Rainsford, the thrill of matching wits against another human. No more mindless beasts, only men who can plan, who can set traps, who can fight back. Rainsford refused to partake in the twisted sport, but his refusal only amused Zaroff. "Then you shall have the honor of being my next quarry," he declared. "You have 3 hours to prepare. After that, the hunt begins." Rainsford fled into the jungle, his mind racing. He was an experienced hunter, but never before had he been the prey. He had to think like an animal, to move without leaving a trail. As the hours passed, he set traps, deadfalls, pitfalls, and snares. Yet Zaroff was no ordinary hunter. Time and again, he avoided the traps, toying with Rainsford, prolonging the chase for his own amusement. 3 days of terror passed. Rainsford, pushed to the limits of endurance, made a desperate gamble. He doubled back toward the mansion, slipping through the darkness and climbing into Zaroff's bedroom. When the general entered, Rainsford stepped from the shadows. "I am still here, General. I have won." Zaroff smiled, almost pleased. "Indeed. But I must warn you, Rainsford. The rules of the game dictate that the winner must claim his prize." Rainsford knew what he meant. "I am still a hunter, General. But I have learned something about fear." As the night deepened, a final struggle took place. When dawn broke over the island, Rainsford stood alone. Zaroff was gone, his game finally ended. Sanger Rainsford had won. But he would never look at hunting the same way again. At Kanchaknapong, R6F.